Did plot happen or prank? Doesn't even seem to be even. Hello again, viewers. Jake here, and admittedly, I have some issues with continuity. But in fairness, so does most of modern day culture. And I don't just mean small things like, someone waking up shaved, or a cut cleaning up just to be bleeding again in another shot. Seriously, still one of my only major complaints about Doctor Strange. I mean continuity within franchises like the ever-popular Marvel Cinematic Universe, or the ever-decisive all the other movie studios trying to ape the continuity without approaching it the same way studio-wise, but I'll get into that soon enough. Now, this is going to be admittedly a fairly loose, unfocused rant about my views of different styles of continuity and different franchises with ongoing continuity both originally and later on. And if my bringing that up has made your eyes cross a bit, just pause the video, take a breather, and preferably come back, watch the rest, and leave a comment about your thoughts about continuity and some of your favorite examples. Don't worry. Wait. Okay, now I know it has to be a prank. Who put something in my cup? And why is it chewy? Nowadays, you'd be hard-pressed to avoid headaches about continuity, especially if you want to keep up with the more recent movie blockbusters, or if you've ever tried to keep track of comic book relaunches. Though really, continuity-tied franchises, or a large number of titles not sharing the same name, being related to each other, or even crossing over to each other, have been a thing throughout pop culture history, including Golden Age comics like Justice Society of America, or TV cartoon shows like many of Hanna-Barbera's Talking Animal series, or even the well-known Hanna-Barbera Again TV movie, The Jetsons Meet the Flintstones. And as I've been reminded by Linkara's amazing History of Power Rangers series, even during the 90s we were able to establish an ongoing continuity over multiple titles, even when using a base show that was never meant to tie into each other in the first place. Speaking of Power Rangers, if you want me to review it and other such American-made tokusatsu adaptations, be sure to donate to my Patreon to hit the appropriate milestones. Patreon dance. However, without a doubt, it's really come to people's attention thanks to the Disney-owned Marvel Cinematic Universe, being the first series of otherwise standalone films pulled into the same universe as each other, allowing for shorthand nods to speed up exposition, or laying the groundwork for bigger things to come in the smaller movies to come to a head in the massive Avenger crossover films. And despite some films being much weaker than others, it still paid off for them enough that now every big blockbuster studio is trying to have interlocked movie continuities. The most obvious being WB's attempted DC Cinematic Universe, and others following in suit trying to hit that same gold mine a second time. But I feel like they missed a big important part of why Marvel's setup works even with something like the Incredible Hulk movie, which, while I liked, did not make back what it cost. This is all that Marvel movie studios owned by Disney does. Thanks to Disney's ownership of Marvel and them stepping in to disconnect the movie side from the rather detestable CEO of Marvel Comics, Marvel Studios is in effect a live-action Pixar for them. That means they can put all their effort into not only making their own movies 3 or 4 at a time, but also knowing what's to come, what came before, and finding what thematically works for each of the varied heroes. Yes, they can often suffer from being safe or samey and not trying too much different between the films, but they can afford to plan out for the next 10 years of movies thanks to both having a set formula that the audience knows that they want to see, And again, these movies being the only thing they work on. This is much different from WB not only trying to make a series of DC films similar in tone and visuals to the dark, muted, muddy feel of Man of Steel, but also extending the Harry Potter cinematic universe to give us Fantastic Beasts and plans for 4 follow-up films before the first one was even released. Not to mention anything else WB ever wants to do. Like, say, another Lego movie, the Lego Batman movie that we know is being made. Anything else that WB may have their thumbs in live action or animated wise. However, interactive media has their share of confusing or annoying continuity choices as well. While such a comment will make people think of the likely never-ending Final Fantasy franchise, for me, it brings to mind SNK's go-to flagship title, King of Fighters, which, along with its own characters and storylines introduced, brought together at least 5 other of their game titles into the same timeline very early on. Though that headache does come alongside the thankfully dying out fighting game franchise headache of not knowing what ending is canon. Thank you for ending that, BlazBlue, Persona 4 Arena, Mortal Kombat 9 and 10, and Street Fighter V. When first making the other games, they did not, I imagine, have any interest of one day combining them, true. Same with Capcom's Street Fighter, Final Fight, and Rival School titles, though really it's just that Street Fighter pulls in characters from Final Fight and Rival Schools to bolster its roster. However, they still work just fine and in fact expand on what could be in any of the titles. But there are examples where, well, the continuity doesn't hurt anything, but its inclusion, I feel, doesn't really help with anything. While 90% of the Tales of JRPG franchise, unless they have a 2 stuck on them, are completely standalone, unrelated titles to each other, taking place on different planets, there keeps coming up attempts to make a new standalone game have ties either in the far past or far future of a pre-existing title, like suggesting connections between the elves in Tales of Symphonia and the history of Tales of Phantasia, or having Tales of Berseria being a centuries-old prequel to Tales of Zestiria. And aside from characters who appear in both due to being ageless, there's nothing I feel to really gain from this. Unless they are meant to be direct sequels made to expand upon the existing stories of previous titles' characters, these games should and can easily be treated as completely apart from each other as any main number Final Fantasy title. Speaking of, tying together Final Fantasy X and 7 is dumb and lame and annoying. And I should make a separate video about my problems with that at a later time. But before I let you go off and talk about some of your favorite or least favorite continuity-tied franchise, there's one last thing I want to bring up and how infuriating I find its so infuriating I can't even say. How infuriating I find its forcing continuity is. While I've played a lot of the titles in this franchise, I am not the biggest fan of Legend of Zelda, especially the more time has passed since I've played it last. Now that might sound weird, especially by my admission that my favorite Legend of Zelda game is Wind Waker, and is one of my top 3 GameCube titles and easily one of my top 5 games of that generation. But I want you to hear out where I'm coming from. I'm a huge nerd who prefers characterization, stylization in his fiction, even if it's not the prettiest or deepest, or even makes no sense whatsoever. Just ask me about Dimension W or my preference of Dragon Ball Super over GT to prove that. While The Legend of Zelda is iconic video gaming through and through and could be seen as the seed of open world video games, which is often one of the most likely subgenres to get critical attention and praise, outside of the symbolic aspects of an elf-like hero wielding a sword and shield against a pig-like wizard to save a princess, there's no real character to it. Link, Zelda, and Ganon are near effectively non-characters, which admittedly could be said about a ton of early video game characters, barely even filling in archetypes placed in the basic layout of a hero's journey cast of hero, princess, and ogre. While the games may have been, at the time or now, amazing examples of how to handle an open explorable world with budding examples of crafting deep narrative, there was no style to it other than fantasy, and no character to it other than hero tale. Even when the epic that was Ocarina of Time came out, while a third dimension of death was added, one could not really pin a character to the cast. It wasn't until Wind Waker that we got both the things I absolutely fall for in fiction. We got the beyond cartoony character models and visually beautiful setting. And with them being so cartoony, every character was allowed to be a character. This is the first Zelda game that I ever got the sense that I knew what Link was actually saying despite him being a mute character. I got a real feel for the cast as characters instead of hero tale archetypes, and it easily had the most aesthetically stylish Ganon yet, not having to resort to having the final battle be against an inhuman pig beast with no humanity to them, and I just repeated myself. Ganon was an actual person who I had to deal with. Yes, he was evil, but there was a person being evil, not an incarnation of evil. However, after Wind Waker and its cartoony visuals, we went back to hyper-realism with the literally dark and grit-focused Twilight Princess, which still admittedly had a lot of style and character, but solely for the impish Midna, and seemingly her alone. It was around the time Skyward Sword and all the things you can say about that title came around that Nintendo officially released a Legend of Zelda reference book, Hyrule Historia, and when I knew, along with my not having gotten a Wii, that my interest in the franchise was confirmably dead, as it had within it an official timeline of all the Legend of Zelda titles. But I had never had an issue with all the Legend of Zelda titles being separate stories. That the same tale of the near same human, albeit with different tools and facing different but similar hardships, to overtake the same evil time and time again, but being different stories. By having each game be a separate take on such a classic setup, referring to the ancient eras of the world like the myth of the three goddesses or in Wind Waker's The Destruction of Hyrule, felt like something you could do anything with. Like each time we learned the lore, we were not learning another piece of the same story, but a whole new lore for this whole new world and time. But once we learned that Skyward Sword was not made simply as an attempted middle ground between cartoon aesthetics of Wind Waker but realistic models of Twilight Princess, but as an ultra prequel to the origin of the Master Sword, my eyes began to glaze over. We don't need an origin of the Sword in the Stone. Do you know why? Because it is The Sword and the Stone. No, I didn't stammer there for once. But now every time the lore or history is brought up, it's no longer lore or history made to fit just that game, but now officially meant to be a hint of when on the timeline this game takes place. This is no longer an example of how even the endless archetypes with no character a game can exist for decades, symbolizing the constant struggle. It's now a literal constant struggle between good and evil. It taints the bittersweetness of even defeating Ganon in Wind Waker for me, because that Ganon is no longer a single man with his own personal struggles. He's no longer a twisted but driven man with his own dreams and flaws. He's just Clone Body 11582, possessed by the evil pig warlock, who happens to possess only the exact same type of body, and is just the most recent in a long chain of blah. I hope this video on continuity has given you something to think about when you approach your favorite franchises, as well as give you a better sense of what you actually want from a connected universe, either story-wise or production-wise, as opposed to what you think you want. Thank you for sitting through another Reading Too Much Into Things rant. I'm Jake, and as always, stay safe.